Hi everyone, and welcome back to Liminal Space, a podcast that seeks to reimagine the world in which we live through conversations with people around the globe who are crossing borders and pushing boundaries with their work, their art, and their thought. Today, I'm in discussion with Sheldon Solomon. Sheldon is an experimental social psychologist at Skidmore College in the United States. He's the co-developer of terror management theory and co-author of the book, The Worm at the Core, on the role of death in life. Sheldon's life work is based on the concept that our knowledge and fear of death is at the core of the human experience and condition, and the hidden motive behind almost everything that we do, how we see the world, and the decisions that we make. His work is deeply rooted in compassion, peace, and love, and has really made a big impact on me. So it was a great honor to be able to have this chat with Sheldon, and now to be able to share it with you. Before we begin, to see more of these episodes, subscribe and hit the bell button below, like and share, and I'd love to hear any thoughts or questions in the comments below. And now, here is my discussion with Sheldon Solomon. Hi Sheldon, welcome to Liminal Space.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here.
I've just finished reading your book, The Worm at the Core, and I thought the best way to start would be to ask you directly, what is it about death and our fear of death that you believe makes it the worm at the core of the human condition?
Yeah, wow. Great question and a good way to start. Basically, the worm at the core is a phrase that we grabbed from William James, the American philosopher who in the 1890s, I believe, that was his phrase to describe death. He called it the worm at the core of the human experience. And a few decades later, in the 1970s, a cultural anthropologist named Ernest Becker, in a book called The Denial of Death, he picked up on that idea. And this is where I got introduced to these notions. I was a young professor in the 1980s, and I saw this book, The Denial of Death, where Becker just says it is that people are unique because on the one hand, like all other living things, we'd like to stay alive. On the other hand, unlike all living things, we're smart enough to know that that basic biological imperative is ultimately doomed to fail, which is just a fancy way of saying we're smart enough to know that we're going to die someday, and we know it way before it's likely to happen, even when our lives are not in danger. And so what Becker argued is that most of us would literally be paralyzed by existential anxiety if that's the only thing we thought about. I'm going to die. I can walk outside and get hit by a comet or smote by a virus, and it would be overwhelming to have to bear those existential excruciations. And so what Becker says is that what we do to manage that existential terror is to just really embrace what he called cultural worldviews, beliefs about the world that gives us a sense that life has meaning and that we have value. And so that's my long-winded response to your question. From our point of view, whether we're aware of it or not, mostly we're not. We spend most of our time on Earth trying to maintain confidence in our cultural beliefs, as well as a secure sense that we're valuable people in that particular world.
And what was it specifically about Becker's work can you talk about how you first discovered his work, and what was it that made you think that this is, how you want to spend a vast majority of your life, going deeper down the rabbit hole?
I would be happy to do that. Like a lot of things, it was essentially an accident. I was marching up and down the halls in the library at Skidmore College in upstate New York, where I work then and now. And I think I was looking for some books by Freud. But anyway, be that as it may, I just noticed the titles of these Ernest Becker books. One of them was called The Birth and Death of Meaning. Right next to it was the other book, The Denial of Death. And right next to that was another book called Escape from Evil. And truth be told, what really caught my eye there were some green dots on the cover of one of the books, which is just silly. But I don't know if I ever would have stopped if I didn't see these little splotches. But anyway, I grabbed this Birth and Death of Meaning book, and in the first paragraph, Becker says, I want to use interdisciplinary study to figure out why people do what they do when they do it. And I was like, yeah, me too, dude. Finally, after getting a PhD, having to suffer through all of these books with this turgid jargon, non-pharmacological interventions for insomnia. Here's a guy just saying, I want to understand why people do stuff. And I was like, yeah, me too. And then the Denial of Death book, when I picked that up, and in the first paragraph, he's like, the terror of death, our disinclination to accept the reality of the human condition, it is the prime mover of human affairs. And honestly, my immediate reaction was, oh man, this strikes me as true, at least for me. Because I have a long-standing disinclination to die. I'm just not a big fan. And my tale in that regard is that I remember, being 8 years old, and it was the day after my grandmother died. And the day before, my mother said, oh, grandma's sick and she's not going to be here much longer. And I knew that. And so this was an expected death. But the next day, it was still sad. And I remember sitting around, and I was thinking, oh, I'm going to miss my grandmother. And then I was like, oh, but wait a minute. That means my mom's going to get old. And that's not going to end well. And then I used to collect postage stamps back in the day. And I was looking at my stamp collection, and a lot of early U.S. postage stamps are of the dead presidents, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. And I'm like, wow, look at all the presidents. They're dead too. And then I was like, oh, but wait a minute. I was like, oh, wait, logic dictates that there'll come a time when I will be on the cusp of oblivion. And I just had like this shudder of existential horror. And so I guess, again, my James Joyce-like length response to your question is part of it was I was captivated by Becker's straightforward prose and his insistence that we should pursue these broad efforts to understand human behavior, and that's going to require that we cross disciplinary boundaries, and that we do that with an eyeball on actually trying to help people. This may sound like some kind of romantic throwback to the days of Woodstock, but he was kind of an Enlightenment guy, and he thought we should really try and use ideas to foster personal growth and social progress. So I was like, I like that. But then it was also quite personal. I realized that when he says that concerns about our own mortality perfuse our lives on many levels, I was like, I believe that to be true, at least for myself.
It's fascinating to hear how, as a child, you had these experiences, and then maybe you were destined to find the 3 green dots on the book, and that your life.
There you go.
And here we are having this chat. It's really interesting. I was only introduced to your work a few months ago, but I can say that your work and discovering it for me had quite a similar impact. Thoughts that I'd probably had, but hearing you speak about these things, and I've just finished reading The Worm at the Core, and it's an incredible incredible piece of work. I haven't yet read The Denial of Death, but I bought that in the past week, and I'll be sitting down to go much deeper. But obviously I think that's the early 80s, was it?
That's right. It was in the early 1980s, yes.
And how was it considered back then? Like, was this something radical? Did people think you were crazy? Was it cutting edge, or were your ideas sort of broadly accepted?
No, it was the cutting edge of crazy. So from the perspective of academic psychologists, Ernest Becker won a Pulitzer Prize for the book, The Denial of Death, but had trouble getting academic jobs because he was considered a not particularly serious scholar by any specific academic discipline. So he crossed them all and was somewhat, therefore, repudiated by each of them. The main concern from the perspective of psychologists was just that it seemed highly speculative, derived from existential philosophy and psychoanalytic work. It was based on claims that most of what's happening psychodynamically is quite unconscious. And so people just said, this has got to be bullshit. Some people said, well, I don't think about death all that much. And so therefore, these ideas must be wrong. And of course, when we would say to them, well, you don't think about death all that much because you're comfortably ensconced in your cultural worldview, which gives you a sense that life has meaning and you have value. Otherwise, you'd be a twitching blob of biological protoplasm, cowering under your chair, groping for a sedative. But of course, you don't win arguments that way, because you're like, oh, either you agree with me and I'm right, or you disagree and I'm right. And so, and then we were young and annoying. So my buddies, Jeff Greenberg and Tom Pazinski and I, we stumbled on these ideas, as young professors in the 1980s, and not lacking in self-confidence, but very much lacking in tact and diplomacy. We would go around our first conference presentation about these ideas. We called it the Psychopathology of social psychology. So we went to a social psychology conference and we're like, wow, why don't social psychologists study anything interesting? And our argument, which sounds kind of glib, and in fact, we were at the time, we just said, well, it seems like what experimental psychologists do is to confine the questions that they ask to the limitations of the methods that we have at our disposal. We said, why don't we just frame our questions first, and then we can work out the empirical corroboration of them, and to which people said, well, okay, then do it. Then if there are merits to these arguments, then step up and show it. And honestly, David, we had two reactions at the time. One of them was to resist a bit on the grounds that we don't think that there's just one way of evaluating the merits of a declarative statement about reality. And so in a sense, we were chafing at this idea that people won't consider any idea seriously in the absence of a body of evidence produced by a specific scientific tradition. All right, on the other hand, that is the tradition that we were trained in. It has been fantastically successful in lots of domains. And so when people said to us, prove it, we were like, well, all right. I used to say in the early 1980s, I got a PhD unscathed by knowledge, armed with a method in search of a question. We had all of these sophisticated methodological skills and statistical skills. And so here was a way, to put them to use. And yeah. So for almost 40 years now, that's pretty much what we've been doing. specifically what we call terror management theory that we write about in the Worm book, is our effort to just frame Becker's ideas in a way, and I'll degenerate into psychobabble for a moment, but we wanted to frame them theoretically so that we can use them to derive hypotheses that we can then assess empirically. English translation, we wanted to see if we could find proof for those ideas.
Yeah, and I find your methodology absolutely fascinating. I guess I'm not an academic, and what I loved about your process and the way it's documented in your book is this experimental way of not just intellectualizing things, but really experimenting, and this idea of death reminders. I mean, this is a genius, a genius way of really getting at the core of what people are thinking, whether they're actually aware of it or not. Can you talk about this death reminder concept?
Yeah, no, I would be happy to. And actually, thank you, David. We're proud of this work. I'm not going to necessarily subscribe to the notion that it's genius, but it is a testament to the people who trained us. We were the lucky beneficiaries of being the students of really the originators of experimental social psychology. And what we learned from our mentor, a guy named Jack Brehm, he was like, you know what? Keep it simple at first. Just see if you're on the right track. And we took that to heart, because basically people said to us, okay, Ernest Becker's saying that your beliefs about reality serve to reduce death anxiety. How could you possibly prove that? And truth be told, we really didn't have any idea. And here's another example, honestly, of where the way science works is not anything like how you see it in textbooks, because you read a book about science and it's as if everything's planned and everything happens in this linear progression on an inexorable path to truth. But we had no idea how we would do that. And then, like a lot of things, we got lucky. We had a student, Jeff Greenberg had a student at the University of Arizona, a graduate student, and she came back from a social work class one day, and she said, oh, in our social work class, it was a death and dying class, we have to write our own obituary. And then she's like, wow. And then to get us in the mood to do that, our teacher said, why don't you look at these two questions? And it was just jot down briefly your thoughts and feelings about your own death. And then the next question was, what do you think is going to be going through your head at the moment that you're dying? And my buddy Jeff Greenberg, he saw that and he's like, that's it. And I'm like, what is it? And he's like, look, Flea Dick, here's what we're going to do. We're going to bring people into the lab, and we'll have some people respond to those questions. So we call it mortality salience, but that just is jargon for we're going to remind them that they're going to die. And then we'll ask other participants the same questions, but not about death. Rather, we'll ask them to think about something unpleasant but not fatal. You're going to the dentist and you're going to be in extreme pain. You've been in a car accident and they had to cut off one of your legs. Things like that. You've been humiliated in public, all negative, but not fatal, because we want to show that whatever might be happening is this singular result of concerns about you dying rather than something else bad happening. And our thought very simply was, if Becker's right, then when we remind people that they're going to die, they should cling more tenaciously to their culturally constructed beliefs. And we should be able to determine that by assessing their reactions to other people And more particularly, what we should find is that when you're reminded that you're going to die, you should like other people who share your beliefs or who support them a whole lot more. And you should hate and even harm, if given an opportunity to do so, people who are opposed to your beliefs or who are merely different. And then, and we can talk about some of the experiments in just a bit, but it turns out over the years that that's not the only way that we remind people of their mortality. So sometimes we have them watch movies where they watch car accidents or people being electrocuted. Sometimes we bring them, we do these experiments outside of the lab where we stop people either right in front of a funeral home or 100 meters to either side. And again, our thought is that if you're standing in front of a funeral home, death may be on your mind, even if you don't even know it. And then, like, the one that I still find the most astonishing, honestly, David, is when we go back to the lab and we park people in front of a computer and they're reading stuff. And while they do that, we flash the word death for like 48 milliseconds or 42 milliseconds, so fast that you can't even see anything. In the control condition, we flash the word pain or field sometimes. So anyway, there's thousands of studies now. And regardless of how you remind people of their own mortality, they show an incredibly wide range of effects. And I'll talk about just a few, and then I'll shut up just to give folks a sense, because the first thing that we were interested in back 40 years ago, we wanted to figure out why people can't get along with other human beings that don't share their beliefs about reality. And we were persuaded by Becker's rather simple argument that if my own beliefs about reality serve to diminish death anxiety, then when I run into somebody who's different, whether I'm aware of it or not, I've got a problem. Because if I accept an alternative depiction of reality, then I'm undercutting my own. So if I believe God created the earth in 6 days, the Fulani and Mali believe the earth's created out of a giant drop of milk, but if they're right, then I've got to be wrong. And so what Becker said is, when we run into people who are different, we denigrate them, we demonize them, we dehumanize them, we try to compel them to adopt our beliefs. And if that doesn't work, we just exterminate them, thus proving that our God and our beliefs are superior after all. And so in some of our early studies, in accord with that view, we found that, for example, Christians reminded that they're going to die, they like Christians a lot more, but they hate Jewish people. In Israel, Jews reminded that they're going to die, they love Jewish people more, and they hate Arabs and Christians. Ditto all over the world. But it's not only attitudes. When Germans are reminded of their mortality, they sit closer to fellow Germans and further away from people who look like they're immigrants. Iranians reminded of death are more supportive of suicide bombers, more willing to become one themselves. Americans reminded of death are more supportive of using nuclear and chemical and biological weapons against countries who do not currently threaten us. And this is particularly true of conservative Americans. But the point is that that's one domain where we feel like there's now a considerable body of evidence in support of the view that existential anxieties underlie, or at least amplify, our tendency, sadly, as human beings, to be intolerant or worse of people that are different than us.
And do you believe this tendency is innate in humans? Like, are we born with this tendency, or is this something that we develop and learn through life? And what about across different nationalities, different age groups, different cultures, indigenous versus non-indigenous?
Yeah, great question. So my silly answer is all of the above. What I mean by that is we are born with an innate tendency to favor our in-group. And this is a result, this is of necessity. It's the result of this has nothing to do with existential anxiety so much as that we are cultural animals and are thereby the beneficiaries of thousands of years of accumulated cultural knowledge. And the bottom line is that none of us would be able to survive for more than a day on the basis of our individual prowess, intelligence, or physical strength. We're here today because all of the things that we've learned over thousands of years are still with us. And in fact, culture is smarter than all of us. We do stuff every day of the reasons for which we know not why. And the point that the evolutionary psychologists make is that there's got to be a strong tendency to favor one's in-group in order to stabilize and maintain bodies of cultural knowledge in order to pass them on over time. I don't know if that makes any sense, but whether we like that or not, it's true. Before little babies can stand, walk, or talk, they show a marked preference for those who look and sound like them. And what some folks have suggested, and I believe them to be fundamentally right, is that out-group hostility, it may be an unfortunate byproduct of the tendency to favor the in-group. It may also have arisen as a strategy to foster intergroup competition. So we don't need to like any of this, but some degree of hostility to people who are different, we may come into the world like that. It doesn't follow from that, though, that we all need, turn into fanatical serial killers. And so I like a guy, Amin Maalouf, in a book called Identity, In a Name of Identity, Violence and the Need to Belong in the 1990s. And he's an interesting gentleman. He's a Lebanese Christian who lives in Paris, writes in France. But his point is that, we are fundamentally tribal creatures. And, but it is when we are threatened existentially that we get to the point where we view life as a zero-sum game in which my own success is predicated on someone else's misfortune. And so this raises an important question for the future, and that is it possible to be attached to one's in-group without the need to denigrate or disparage another? Alternatively, and even better, is it possible, to the extent that human beings enjoy existing as a species, is it possible for us to expand our definition of who we are? Because to the extent that we all identify as members of the same species, that would be even better, because then all of these innate pro-social tendencies that are in fact magnified under threat, they can be harnessed to bring out the best in us.
That's exactly what I was thinking when I was reading your book. This idea that, well, the question I had is how has it occurred that we have these in and out groups? And I'll give an example. I spent a lot of time in Papua New Guinea. Small island, 7 million people, more than 900 cultural groups, language groups. And you can have a situation where you have a river and you have one tribe on one side, another tribe on the other side, speaking different languages, having different cultures, and are at war. Now, how is it possible that we're seeing that as the other, as opposed to seeing us at, like instead of saying we're one tribe and the group on the other side of the river is one tribe? How is it possible that we haven't come to the conclusion that as a species we are the tribe, humans are the tribe, and we are on path perhaps to exterminate ourselves, thinking that we're not part of a greater whole, that we're just a whole lot of tribes competing against each other?
Yeah, no, brilliant, David. I think without sounding defensive on behalf of humankind, I think for most of our history, we didn't have the luxury to step back and to see us as you most eloquently depicted it a second ago. And I'm saying this not as an expert, but rather as an interested dilettante. I've been reading a lot about cultural evolution, and I don't like seeing any of these things, but evidently back in the day, different cultures, different groups under very challenging environmental conditions competed with each other for limited resources. And so in an ancestral environment where you spent most of your waking moments trying to, stuff a dead squirrel in your mouth, didn't have, and all you knew is that those other people across the river, if you let your guard down, were going to run over and steal your food and your wives or enslave your kids. You didn't really have the time even perhaps some would argue the subjective capacity to view oneself detached from one's own clan or tribe to render this notion of a common humanity possible. And in fact, some people argue that until Christianity arose, that was the first truly ecumenical cosmopolitan religion where it's like everyone, it's a big tent. Everyone is welcome to be. And so maybe we're only now at a point in our history by virtue of technology as well as necessity where we better figure out how to reconceive of ourselves in that fashion. I mean, for one thing, at least empirically, we know that to be the way to go. My buddy Tom and his students did some experiments using what they call a common humanity prime. And all that is that in a study, they tell some people, you know what? Humans all over the world, we are a whole lot more similar than we are different. And even if it sounds silly or corny, we are one big family, which has the benefit of being true in that humans are really a homogeneous species. Every one of us came from a small original band of creatures in Africa, I'm told. And so that has the virtue of being true. Anyway, when we do that, and then we remind people that they're going to die, they don't hate somebody from another country because presumably they have now been at least momentarily reminded of our commonality with our fellow humans. And to me, this would be almost, on the to-do list for planet Earth. That would probably be the point number one, is to start to forge a common identity as fellow human beings, because whether we like it or not, if this is maybe obvious, but the pandemics of the world, which is, by the way, a minor inconvenience, I'm told, compared to the incoming environmental apocalypse that will happen in the next decade, on top of a global economic order that, when it collapses, is apt to crush all of Earth. Anyway, the problems, the challenges that now confront the human species are ones that, while surely have to be attended to at the local level, equally surely require attention that will span, all countries. But unfortunately, that's, as you know, not the way the world is currently drifting. So here we are needing to be more and more alike. And that's against the rising tide of kind of populist nationalist movements that are trying to differentiate us. And that does not bode well for the future of humanity.
Yeah, I share your slightly pessimistic views on the future, sadly. I think that reading about these death experiments, what was really interesting, it seemed that along with this fear of death, it seemed to be sort of I don't know if it's a selfish gene or a greedy gene, but it seemed to be the fear of me dying which dictated my decisions rather than the fear of my community dying or my fellow man. It sort of, did you do experiments that also looked at this sort of collective, like people, how they feel about not their own mortality, but the sort of the extermination of the human species?
Yeah, there is some work there, although I'm not as familiar with it as I need to be, David. It's called Extinction Anxiety, and and I do believe that that's a potent phenomenon. On the other hand, I can't remember. I think it's in the Ernest Becker book, Denial of Death. You'll get to it when you get there. But early on, he talks about, like Aristotle says, there's nothing more thrilling than when the guy next to you gets hit with the arrow. Mm-hmm. The point being that death is most bothersome because it pertains to us. We have done some studies where we've asked people to ponder somebody else dying, and that doesn't create defensive reactions except if it reminds us in so doing that we too will die. So this is really about, us.
And is it mainly a conscious situation or subconscious? Did you find that most participants were aware that they had this fear of death and that sort of was how they was such a big part of their life and how they made decisions, or something that they didn't know? Were you able to tell your participants the results, and how did they react to that?
Most folks, when we talk to them about these studies, are quite dumbfounded and reluctant to admit that it is even possible that they could be influenced, let's say by standing in front of a funeral home or having the death flashed into their brain. No, these effects are quite subtle and mostly beneath the level of conscious awareness, and which raises an important point that we try to write about in our book, and that is that those kinds of fleeting reminders of death, that's very different than the ongoing and protracted and very conscious and deliberative efforts to think about the fact that we're mortal. Since antiquity, the philosophers and the theologians in lots of cultures, there are very rich traditions that if you're gonna be able to live fully, you need to accept the reality of your own finitude. So I like Albert Camus, in the 20th century, saying, come to terms with death. Thereafter, anything is possible. And so you have the Tibetan book of living and dying. You've got the medieval monks working with the skulls on their desk and so on. And that's important, not to become preoccupied with mortality. This is not, the goal is not to perseverate about death, so much as to be very explicit about recognizing that it is not only inevitable, but potentially imminent in every moment in our lives. Well, that brings out the best in us. It's these kind of momentary reminders of death, because what we've shown in our other studies is that what happens automatically when death enters our mind is there's active efforts to get it out of our minds. And then once that happens, that's when we start bolstering faith in our cultural worldview and trying to boost our self-esteem. And those are the kinds of, I call them malignant manifestations of death anxiety that are often bring out the worst in us, let's say.
And do you believe that it's actually our fear of death, or it's the fear of the unknown, in that we don't know what happens after death? Why are we terrified of death?
Yeah. Probably, yeah. I would say the unknown, but there's a lot of things that I don't know that don't bother me.
Yeah.
I don't know how many stars are in the sky, or like my buddy Jeff Greenberg says, you're like, oh, death bothers me because it's uncertain. And he's like, okay, so I'll come to your house at noon tomorrow and kill you. So now you're sure. So what?
Well, okay, let me rephrase it.
No, I'm being silly, but no. All right, so I'll give you Ernest Becker's response, and I don't know where I stand on this. So Becker, he has a lengthy footnote, David, and he says, look, death is a really complicated, multi-dimensional construct that has potentially very different meaning and concern for different individuals. And here it gets a little globby in that, so what researchers have done is to confirm that that's the case, because what they find is that there are death anxiety scales that have different little, what they call subscales. So some people are afraid of death because of the unknown aspects. Some are afraid because of the physical discomfort with the prospect that worms are going to be crawling out of where your eyeballs used to be. So there's a physical aspect of death. Other people are primarily concerned about the relational aspects of death. What's going to do to the folks that are left behind? Other folks are concerned about their own personal pursuits and the fact that they will depart from this world with proverbial and literal unfinished business. And so it's a great question. And the short answer is that, yeah, there's a lot going on. But having said all of that, it still comes back in the long run to the central point, which is the realization of one's own personal mortality. It is just literally, as Freud put it, it is the one thing that does not compute in an uber rational creature driven by, in Freud's language, the id, which is just this biological imperative to keep living. So it's really just, it's really quite astonishingly incongruent with the desire to live.
I think that's, I won't ask you the question because it's an unanswerable question. What's the meaning of life, the purpose of life? But I know that, many looking at existential philosophy, sometimes the purpose of life is to make your own purpose in life. And perhaps it's just to live, which is the purpose of life.
So perfect, David. Becker, he has the book, The Birth and Death of Meaning. And the students are always like, what is this dude saying? Birth and death. And my point is, and this is very hard for young students, is he's saying that it's not straightforward. Because as to elaborate on what you were intimating a moment ago, the existentialists say, yeah, life is not intrinsically meaningful. And of course, the first reaction is, oh, put a flaming stick in each of my eyeballs. That's a giant turd in my metaphysical punch bowl. But it does, they're not saying that life is intrinsically meaningless. So there's the task as well as the privilege of constructing one's own meaning. All right, but some folks say, and you just there's a German philosopher, what was his name? Goethe, or Goethe, as I used to call him. But and this in the 1700s, and he said something like the purpose of life is to live. And sometimes maybe we overthink things that, in our zeal to improve ourselves and the world around us, we may make life more complicated than it is in our finest moments when we're just spontaneously exuberant at the prospect of just being here.
Yeah. It reminds me of something that I was told, so I can't specifically go to the source, but that, for example, a human cannot drown him or herself. If you attempt to drown yourself, apparently your instincts kick in and you actually try to save yourself at the same time. So if you try to end your life consciously, you almost won't allow yourself to do that. So you have to tie a big weight to yourself to actually drop, because you're still going to be fighting as an instinct or something much deeper. Maybe it's a evolutionary sort of instinct to stay alive.
Yeah.
But I mean, look, I think it's absolutely wonderful to ponder these thoughts. The thing that I was thinking about the unknown was, like, we're scared of the dark. But
Yes.
We're not actually scared of the color black. We're scared that the dark hides a threat that we can't see. We're fearful of deep water, not because we can't swim, but because we can't see the baddies that can come behind and grab us.
No, I think you're onto something. The philosopher Heidegger, and I've been reading his work, although it's hard for me because I don't have a background in philosophy. But he talks about the German word is Angst, and he says we come into the world, but long before we even know that we're here. And it's often translated as anxiety, but evidently in German, it's a more subtle term that has connotations of like feeling unsettled and not at home. And so, yeah, the darkness and the night, has primordial associations with the unforeseen, the ultimately unknowable, and thereby fundamentally uncontrollable and always subject to wholesale dissolution. Yeah, we stand on tenuous foundations.
Yeah. Which sort of the natural progression, I think, is to then talk about religion and faith, which includes in many or most religions some idea of what happens after you die, whether that's reincarnation or heaven, or, how have your studies looked at that, looked at the way that people that have a faith have that same fear, or does having that faith of an afterlife actually, or that belief in an afterlife, lower or even remove an anxiety of death?
Yeah, so that's a complicated question. The short answer is for some. And so it gets back to there's a lot going on. In general, our argument is that religion does serve for adherence to buffer death anxiety. This is not to say, however, that it is why religion arose or the only thing that it does. It seems fairly certain that the original adaptive function of religion was to foster social coordination and social cohesion, and it does that extraordinarily well. Our argument is that there came a moment where self-consciousness reached a critical threshold beyond which the concerns about not dying entered into the picture, and immortality ideologies became more central to established religions. Regardless, though, of the evolutionary argument, what we do know is that when we remind religious people that they're going to die, they become more confident that God exists. They become more confident in the efficacy of prayer. And we know that atheists go the other way. So when atheists are reminded that they're going to die, they become less confident that there's a God and less confident that prayer would ever do anything. Right, but there is a caveat, though, and that is that if you remind atheists that they're going to die, and you measure their unconscious affection for supernatural beliefs, they say they believe less in God, but unconsciously they become more attracted to supernatural concepts. So even atheists, when push comes to shove, they may say that they don't believe in God, but their body is taking respectful issue with that
claim. And you yourself have, on your own personal journey, well, I imagine doing this life work, that you've also it's prompted you to think deeply about your own life and your own beliefs. And have you found that your own views on death and perhaps afterlife and so forth has been directly affected by the results of these experiments that you've done?
Yeah, that's awesome. No, not at all. In fact, most likely the experiments have provided 40 years of a distraction by making this into my professional pursuit. I've managed to intellectualize the ideas, and in so doing, spare myself the burden of actually considering them. Now, all right, having said that, I hope I'm making modest progress. I'm still not a fan of dying. I like being alive, but I hope that I will learn from the folks around me, my parents and my wife's parents, who lived and died with grace and dignity. I hope I'm getting there. I hope I am better now when I think about myself. I try to, from time to time, say, okay, why am I doing what I'm doing? Did I write a book because I feel like these ideas are important and I hope to share them with other folks in a sincere effort to spread good ideas around? Or is that frankly bullshit and I wrote a book because I want to be rich and famous and end up on TV? Now, it's probably a little bit of both. But I would like to think that that engaging with these ideas have pushed me further in the direction of having profited from them.
Yeah, I'm sure. So many others have benefited from reading and understanding your work. So, including myself, I thank you very much for that. One of the things that I didn't expect to read in your book was about self-esteem, and you've mentioned it once today. But if you don't mind, I might read just a short sentence or a couple of sentences from
Go right ahead.
The Worm at the Core. It is deeply disturbing to have one's fundamental beliefs called into question, take our meanings and purposes away. characterize them as juvenile, useless, or evil, and all we have left are the vulnerable physical creatures that we are. Because cultural conceptions of reality keep a lid on mortal dread, acknowledging the legitimacy of beliefs contrary to our own, unleashes the very terror that those beliefs serves to quell. So we must parry the threat by derogating and dehumanizing those with alternative views of life, by forcing them to adopt our beliefs and co-opting aspects of their cultures into our own, or by obliterating them entirely. Such a powerful paragraph, and this idea that our self-worth and our self-esteem is threatened greatly by perhaps being wrong and another worldview being right. And I guess that's also the basis of a history of colonization, I guess, of people coming and telling others that their gods are wrong, their language is wrong, their, even the color of their skin is wrong in lots of ways. I wonder if you can sort of talk to that.
Well, no, you just did it. That's really, in a proverbial nutshell, Becker's account of why we find ourselves now in difficult straits, and why another guy I'm fond of, Robert J. Lifton, in a book called Destroying the World to Save It, it was Lifton who said that we may be the first form of life to be responsible for our own extinction by virtue of our incapacity to arrest that very process, which is to react to people who are different as if they pose an existential threat to our very existence. And there's one study, David, that we write about in the book, and we didn't do it, which is even better because, frankly, everyone's fond of their own ideas. And so when we started doing these experiments back in the day, and we were the only ones doing them, that was interesting, but it only becomes science when other people get interested and they start replicating these ideas and extending them in interesting directions. With one of our students, who's now a professor himself, Jeff Schimmel, he's at the University of Alberta, and they did a remarkable study where Christians in Canada, they read an article. So basically, they were reminded of death or not, just like all of our studies, basically. And then some of them read an article about Muslims going to a pilgrimage in Mecca, and they were on a plane, and while they were flying there, the plane crashed, and all of the Muslims on the plane died. And it's a complicated study, but the part of it that, for our purposes, is very simple, is that Christians who read about a plane load of Muslims dying, when they were reminded of their own death anxiety was lower. In other words, the death of our enemies reduces my own death anxiety. I can't think of a more ominous finding for the future well-being of humankind. And hence the urgency of back to our earlier conversation, hence the utter need to really broaden the scope of this idea of we. There's an author I like, she's dead, Doris Lessing, a novelist. She was South African, and she wrote books in the early 1980s, and they were science fiction, like set in space in many centuries from now. And there are these like creatures that are at war all the time. And Doris Lessing, she called it the substance of we feeling, SOWE. And it's, again, it's a little silly, but not. She's like, look, things get bad whenever, for whatever reason, we lose track of our common humanity.
Mm.
And when we wrote that passage in the book, I wrote that. Sometimes writing doesn't come easy for me. Talking comes easy, but not writing. Oh, there's our serial killing dog. Anyway, I wrote that and I was like, geez, wow. If that's true, we're doomed.
Yeah.
Scruffy.
I felt exactly the same way. I felt all the hairs on my arms raise as you said that. That's sort of a surefire way to our own extinction. So what can people that are watching and listening to this, what can we do? What can we do to improve the we and to kind of try to eliminate this idea of us and them and the other? Are there things that academics can do? Are there things that filmmakers can do? I mean, I attempt to do that in my own filmmaking by showing the shared humanity across people.
And that would be my view is, yeah, everyone's got to pursue this in their own way through their own means. And I'm saying that in part because I have no idea how to proceed. And yet, I know how not to proceed. It's not going to be egghead professors like me writing academic papers that 6 people will read. I think that it's the artists, it's folks like you that are moved by these ideas that are going to be able to present them in ways that engage the average individual's imagination and because people were naturally storytellers and we love to hear stories. We're not naturally literate creatures. We're reluctant readers, but we like visual and auditory stimuli. So even if this sounds naive, I think the hope is that these ideas are sufficiently compelling that step one is to put them in general circulation. Like Ernest Becker in his Escape from Evil book, he's like, I wish everyone would just hear these ideas. He's like, how come there's not somebody at the United Nations just explaining this to world leaders? I've always thought that that's what we set as our task, because we've always said there's nothing original about our work. The only thing that's original is we don't claim that it's original. We just feel like these ideas have merit. And that one possibility is that if they were sufficiently injected in public discourse, that there would be a critical inflection point where folks would step back and say, wow, I mean, you sort of did. That's why we're talking. I did when I first bumped into these ideas. I thought the same thing that you said earlier, David. I was like, this puts into words things I've been thinking about, but haven't been able to articulate. And beyond that, I don't have much more to my discredit to offer, except let's get these notions in circulation and point out that it is not silly or naive to argue, at least abstractly, on behalf of the claim that humanity's future is in part dependent on our capacity to, again, expand the scope of who we are. I think that's on solid ground from an evolutionary as well as an existential perspective.
Yeah. Well, it gives me hope. Yeah. I mean, it gives me hope that, you were able to look beyond yourself and you continue to sort of look at the bigger picture and you as part of an us and a we rather than tribal. And obviously education is a key part of this as well. And it seems it's counterintuitive. The more the world has opened with the internet and with social media, that was supposed to have joined us together, but it seems to be day by day becoming more polarizing in lots of ways.
Yeah, that's a that'll we'll have to get together again for talking about that, because that could take us another few hours. It is a peculiar moment in time. In part, I would submit, because of that technology, which has the capacity to liberate and transform the planet, as well as to reduce us into a smoldering heap. It could go either way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I read with fascination what you wrote about September 11 being a huge death reminder, and how things very quickly changed in only a matter of weeks about public perception of US leaders at the time and so forth. I mean, that was probably a once in a generation or even more death reminder. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I was in Manhattan that day, and so it was another one of these very personal experiences. But um, what happened shortly after September 11th, 2001, is George W. Bush was president in the US, and his approval rating went from the lowest in the history of polling in our country to the highest 3 weeks later. And this was after President Bush responded to those events by saying, we will rid the world of evil, and that he believed God had chosen him to lead the country at this time. And that reminded us of Max Weber, a German sociologist, who said in the early part of the 20th century that in times of historical upheaval, we tend to embrace a certain kind of political leader. Weber called them charismatic leaders, like seemingly larger than life individuals that often are believed or believe themselves to be divinely ordained to rid the world of evil. And we were like, wow, it sounds like President Bush is a charismatic leader. Maybe Americans are thrilled with him right now, not because he did anything great, but because these are the kinds of leaders that we embrace under these circumstances. And so we did a bunch of studies in 2003 and 4 where we showed that Americans really didn't care for President Bush all that much, unless you reminded them that they were going to die first, and then they liked him a lot. And we found the same thing in 2016 with now President Trump, who also said basically, I'm the only one that can save you from, I'm going to build a wall to keep the immigrants out, and we're going to bomb the shit out of ISIS, and so the terrorists won't be here. Forgetting for the moment that there was no threat of terrorism, nor were immigrants actually harming the country. But that doesn't matter. What matters is if you perceive that you're being threatened. And the same thing happened in 2016. We found that in studies that Americans liked Hillary Clinton more than Donald Trump, except if you reminded them of their mortality first, and then they liked Trump a lot more. And same thing, by the way, in the last election, even though Joe Biden won. And that is that for white people, in the study that we did right before the election, they liked Biden a lot more than Trump in a control condition, but they liked Trump a lot more than Biden if death was on their mind. And so we're in a very curious moment in our history because here we are in the middle of a virus which reminds people of death all the time. And President Trump, I call him Orange Hitler, not out of any fondness, his approval rating has never been higher, despite him being grotesquely incompetent. And that's just a factual statement. I say that on the basis of his mishandling of the virus. And yet, his support amongst Americans remains, frankly, obscenely high. And our explanation for that is that death anxiety is such that his supporters cling to him tenaciously, even though he's literally killing them. So it's no different than the Jimmy Jones guy in Guyana. Here was a cult leader who said, drink the Kool-Aid. And now we've got the orange Kool-Aid. So you've got Trump saying to his supporters, you need to, only weaklings wear masks, and the virus is just going to go away. And so if you're a good American, you'll just run around without a mask outside, licking your neighbor while you scream and yell.
And what have you continued your studies into 2020? I mean, we're in this sort of, if September 11 was a huge death reminder, my personal take on what's happening this year is that in the so-called, I'm in Australia at the moment, in the so-called developed world, for many of us, we always thought that threats were something that happened to someone else or somewhere else, or, I believe that for many of us, it's the first time that we've had to face the prospect of our own mortality.
That's right.
Whether that be someone young or someone old. And I would be interested to know how you think that will manifest both currently and also in the future, because in your book you talk about this idea that this fear has a sort of a continued, it's not just the current, it goes into the future as well. So how do you see this year playing out and in the coming years?
Yeah, wow, great question, David. Based on some of the epidemiological work, I think there's going to be a large chunk of humanity in the developed world that are going to have PTSD-like symptoms for the better part of a decade. The social isolation and economic insecurity is going to crush a chunk of folks. I haven't been paying attention in Australia. I do know in the US, for example, that about 25% of the adults in the US are showing signs of PTSD. So that's going to be one chunk of humanity. There's going to be another chunk of humanity that doesn't have the luxury of PTSD because they're going to be wanting to have a place to sleep and maybe something to eat. And so that's going to create another boatload of daunting difficulties. I see another chunk of humanity just entering cults and lunatic fringes. So I think we're going to see extreme political polarization, religious fanaticism. And then there's going to be another chunk of humanity, if there's a vaccine and if it works and if we can move around in a year. My fear is that half of the people in the developed world will then carry on a year from now as if nothing has happened, thus ensuring that we've learned nothing from this experience and that Lifton may be right about us being the first form of life to be responsible for our own extinction. Kierkegaard, you'll read about this in the Denial of Death book. He just says that one way that we deal with death anxiety is we tranquilize ourselves with the trivial. And so I can see a whole lot of that, which we're all prone to. I suspect all of us have, maybe watched too much TV or too many silly whatever distractions that we use. But for some folks, that'll be the sole focus of their lives.
Yeah.
And yet, let me not, though, just leave it at that, because then I think there's another chunk of humanity that has been jolted, that the existential anxieties that, as you put it, David, that I'm sitting here, I've led a privileged life. Excuse me. You know, my parents, they lived through the Depression, and my relatives, like, through the Holocaust and stuff. My biggest problem in my life is, oh, what color shirt am I going to wear? Not am I going to have lunch, but what am I going to eat for lunch? Well, yeah, the pandemic was the first time I was like, oh shit, fuck me. This could maybe not end well. Well, I think for a lot of people, not just old timers, I think for a lot of the youth, that the virus like sandblasted away any illusion that they may have had that the world as we know it is stable, tenable, and sustainable in its present form. A radical overhaul of our economic and ecological infrastructure is absolutely necessary if humankind as we know it is to persist in the relatively near future. And so I think there's going to be another clump of humanity that are going to come out of this exhilarated and energized and will use this as a real opportunity for creative transformation. Now, again, if that makes me naive, then so be it. I'm not saying it's going to not be ugly. You know, I can imagine a world in which 90% of humanity is not with us in a century. But who's to say that that's necessarily a bad thing? You know, it's kind of a somber possibility. But I like the folks who kind of, you know, like William Faulkner, all of these, they write novels about how bad things are, but they basically say, when Faulkner won a Nobel Prize in Literature, when he accepted it, he's like, everybody asks me why I write these novels about everyone fighting and all this bad stuff. And he's like, no, I write it because my point is that despite all of our foibles and weaknesses, when push comes to shove, humanity has always stepped up. And I believe in my gut that we will not only survive, but we will thrive and prosper, even if it takes some interesting and unpleasant detours. And I'm going to go with that.
Well, I'll give you, you may be interested, I'm in Melbourne, in Victoria, in Australia, and we had one of the longest and most restrictive lockdowns in the Western world.
Oh, I know that.
And we came out of that, we're slowly coming out of that, and we've now had 40 days of zero COVID cases. Zero. We did have mandatory masks everywhere, and that's been removed in the past week or so. But it's been really interesting, and I can say a bit shocking to me, to see that there is still a percentage, and at times a large percentage, of people just walking down the street that are still wearing this mask that perhaps 6 months ago would have been so far from their reality, and
that's right.
They would have laughed at you if they would have said there'd be zero cases and you're still walking around with a mask. So I can see there's been a very deep impact of this on people, whether we're conscious of that or not. And I hope that what happens is that we are finally able to, I have a fear and a hope. The fear is that in some months, years, hopefully some things get back to normal and we just move on and we forget about these other existential crises that are around us. The hope is that we actually look at the whole globe and we look at these other, not just existential threats to ourselves, but disease, viruses, so forth, that are affecting the undeveloped world that we haven't given a hoot about. And now all of a sudden we've found the threat to our own lives, and we're doing everything in our power to make us safe. So I hope that this actually comes into our consciousness and makes us more aware, more loving, more wanting to see ourselves as part of this greater whole, which includes looking after those that aren't as lucky as us to get this vaccine in only a matter of months and so forth, where there are diseases that have been left, untouched for decades and hardly get any attention, hardly get any funding and so forth. Where are you on this? Are you optimistic or are you pessimistic, or let's see what the future will hold?
Yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic, if for no other reason than to be otherwise is just a recipe for despair.
Yep.
And no, I am cautiously optimistic. Just reading about the 1918 pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu, that was bad, and people were stupid then as they are now. Maybe not in Australia, but in the US, there were anti-mask riots. I think, and to be silly but not, as other folks have pointed out, that this is not the first time that we've been in a pandemic. It's not the first time that we've been in a situation where, half of Earth could be possibly summarily obliterated, and yet we've appeared to have made it through those. Let's hope for the best. I'm gonna
Yeah.
go with that.
Well, I absolutely could spend hours and hours going deeper in these. I'm very conscious of your time and just utterly thankful that you've been so generous with your thoughts, your time. So let me thank you for your work. Let me thank you for, I think in this world, everything plays a role, in the sense that sometimes we need sparks to start thought, to start a process. And discovering your work in the last few months has definitely expanded my thoughts and view on this sort of looking at us, and inspired me to keep going with that. So I thank you for that, and also hope that, well, I'm sure that people that both watch and listen to this discussion can think more deeply about these issues, and absolutely discover your book, The Worm at the Core, and the work of Ernest Becker. I really thank you greatly, and I can say you're very much bringing solidarity to this world that seems to be becoming more splintered day by day.
Yeah. No, thank you, David. This was a pleasure, and let's keep going. I look forward to exchanging ideas in the future.
Well, maybe the next chat we can go deeper into technology and social media and
I would love that.
Aspects of it. Great. Sheldon, it's been an absolute honor and pleasure, and thanks very much. And we'll hopefully chat soon.
Very good.
Okay.
All right.
Bye.
Bye now.
Many thanks for watching. I'd love for you to be notified of new episodes, so subscribe and hit the bell button below. Like and share this video, and feel free to leave any comments or questions below. You can also visit liminalspace.earth to discover all episodes. But for now, many thanks again, and I'll see you next time in a liminal space.